Thanks very much, Mike. And hi, everyone. Greetings from a very rainy Cumbria, characteristically rainy Lake District. A lot of what I'll be saying today is as Jeff said, based on this book, Too Hot to Handle. So if what I say whets your appetite, do have a look at that. All the royalties are going to various climate causes. I'm going to start with a provocation from a provocative man, James Lovelock, who's an Earth system scientist, now 100 years old. A little while ago, he expressed his deep frustration with our collective inability to tackle climate change. And he said, it may be an issue as serious as war. It may be necessary to put democracy on hold for a while. And I think what James Lovelock articulated in those very stark terms was something that actually I think many of those pushing for climate action feel, that democracy somehow gets in the way of climate action, that experts and maybe even environmental groups should be in the driving seat. And in my work on the work that I've done over the past 20 years on climate strategy, this call for expert-led decisions is something that I have seen constantly. So every day there are new reports and new bits of research saying what needs to be done. And you know, they range from the most obvious and everyday, like the need for a comprehensive shift to renewables, to things which are, you know, speculative and unproven, like sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. So there's no shortage of experts offering solutions. But what I've seen is far less attention paid to the crucial question of how we, as a human society, should debate, agree, and carry out plans to tackle climate change. And I sometimes find this surprising that even environmental groups, even democratically elected governments, have been pretty reluctant to actually reach out beyond their sort of core base and talk to people, have a dialogue about what needs to happen. So the dominant approach by government has been what I've called climate policy by stealth. So focusing on those things like decarbonisation of the power sector, for example, that can be done without people noticing. And the dominant approach by environmental groups, with honourable exceptions, the dominant approach has been to appeal to their core, essentially, to try and appeal to their members and get their members more active, but not think so much about widening their reach. So I think this lack of attention to democracy and outreach is deeply problematic. And my own research actually suggests that we need more democracy, not less, if we're going to solve the climate crisis. 3 reasons why we need more democracy, not less. The first is a very practical one. So as reports from the Committee on Climate Change make clear, we can't get to net zero without people noticing. So the changes ahead, whether that be changes to transport, to land use, to the way we generate electricity, they need people to engage. And people are experts in their own lives. They know how they live in their houses, they know how they want to travel. And so there's a very practical reason why we need to listen to people and involve them in the changes to make sure that they're designed in the ways that work for them. And the second reason is essentially a moral reason. So, you know, scientists can tell us the science, economists can offer their modelling, environmental activists can, offer their passion and point of view, but climate change affects all of us in different ways. And what gives the sort of self-appointed experts the right to say that people shouldn't be involved, that it shouldn't be tackled through democracy? Why should we make the assumption that citizen voters need to be bypassed? And instead, I mean, this is sort of, you know, when you think about it, it's really obvious that we should in fact be assuming that if we give people enough evidence, enough responsibility, enough stake in the process, most people would support action to protect the planet that sustains their life. So there's the second reason is that moral one. And the third, and linked, is the deficiencies that we see in our current democratic system. And I think this is something we're going to come back to in this debate, judging by those introductions to the speakers. there are really problematic power relations in politics, as you can, as you'll grasp by looking at any newspaper at the moment. There's very good evidence that incumbent companies and industries have really strong influence over politics. So this matters for climate because we need a really quick transition away from the status quo, and that means changes to the economy. So the companies of the future, by definition, because they're smaller and in some cases don't exist yet, those companies of the future, by definition, never have as loud a voice as the companies whose very reason for existence might be threatened, like the oil and gas majors, for example. So we need to look at how we can tackle this imbalance in the democratic system. So let me shift then to what needs to be changed, what needs to change, and how we could tackle climate change in a democratic way. My first point might sound really obvious, but I think it's absolutely crucial. There's a need to speak out, to have an end to this climate politics by stealth. Politicians need to speak really openly about the significance of climate change, and they need to ask people to play their part. And I think the upsurge of climate emergency declarations that happened particularly last year is, I really hope, the starting point for this more honest politics. So once you're speaking out, what do you say? Well, the critical thing is, and I have this conversation with politicians, the critical thing is to tell a story of transformation, how acting on climate change is both necessary and desirable, and how it links to our other priorities as a society, like jobs, health, and fundamentally well-being. And obviously this story of transformation is never more important than now, when we're in the worst economic and health crisis that we've ever felt. So there's speaking out, and then there's engagement. So, lots of people are experts on decarbonisation, but those experts are not expert in people's lives. And I think that we should have the humility to ask people to work with experts to design climate action that works for them. And that's very much the spirit behind this incredible experiment that I've been part of this past year, Climate Assembly UK. That's where we took 110 citizens selected to be representative of the country as a whole in terms of educational background, age, gender, ethnicity, geography, and attitude to climate change. And they heard evidence on climate, talked about possible solutions, and offered their recommendations to government. I'd really recommend a read of their report, which I can put a link in the chat when I've finished. But all my experience of these initiatives has shown me that when you give people the space to learn, to think, to discuss, citizens can offer up a really comprehensive and often actually quite radical set of answers to a tricky question. So I would suggest that processes like Climate Assembly UK and the many processes that have happened at local levels as well can be used not to replace democracy, not to replace representative democracy, not instead of voting, but as well as voting, as a supplement to improve the way that democracy works. Because we all know that a vote every 5 years is a very blunt instrument. It's a pretty limited way of telling politicians what sort of a world you want to live in. So I'd really like to see those deliberative processes built into our democracy as an inbuilt requirement, and for them to just become part of the way we do politics, as much for COVID recovery as for climate. And in my final 2 minutes, I just want to say what this means we can all do as individuals. And it very much reflects those things that I've just talked about. The first thing is for you as an individual to speak out, and particularly, with people who you might not naturally have this conversation with. There's an organisation called Climate Outreach who've done some brilliant work on how to have a climate conversation. I'd really recommend their stuff. Secondly, talk to your MP and local elected representatives. I won't say any more about that because Rachel is the foremost expert on that. I do think protest is important. So, if you feel able, I would absolutely protest. Difficult at the moment, of course, with the COVID restrictions, but protests over the past 2 years have honestly made such a difference. And there's a funny contradiction about protest, which is the least likely you are as a protester, the more you're listened to. So if you sort of appear as a stereotypical protester, I know this is not necessarily as it should be, the less you get listened to. Whereas people who aren't sort of usual protest suspects, like for example all the doctors and NHS staff who came out for Extinction Rebellion, they're listened to because it's sort of more surprising and less easy for a politician to pigeonhole. The last thing I'd say, which cuts across all those suggestions, is that this is absolutely a conversation, and it's really important. One of the things that deliberative processes do really well is start from where people are at with their views and values that they bring to the table and their own personal expertise. And it's absolutely crucial to make this a two-way conversation. And then bottom of my list, but also important, is the practical things that you can do to reduce your own carbon footprint. They are absolutely crucial, but they're actually more crucial in terms of being able to then give the message out to others and build the movement. So, of course, eating less meat and using your car less is necessary, but its effect is hugely amplified if you talk about why you're doing that. So I think that the situation we're in right now with COVID makes it all the more critical to tackle the politics of climate change. It's not a case, I think, of holding back and waiting till our current crisis is over, because the opportunity for a climate-focused recovery from COVID is there for the taking. But what really worries me at the moment about politics is just because it's necessary to have a climate-focused economic recovery, just because we have the evidence that it needs to happen, doesn't mean that it will happen. The thing that makes a difference, I think, is getting the politics right, and getting the politics right does mean a huge effort from all of those of us who really care passionately about doing all we can to mitigate the climate crisis. Thank you.